These first 16 verses of Acts 28 that we've just had read to us, we could title Rome at Last. They tell us about the last stage, or last stages, I suppose I should say, of Paul's trip to Rome as a prisoner. And we'll do what we've done on the previous couple of occasions. We'll look at the narrative, and then we shall draw out some lessons, although we will, of course, pick out some things as we go through the narrative. Perhaps you recall that at the end of chapter 27, all 276 people on board the ship, they jumped off when it started breaking up to either swim ashore or to float ashore on broken pieces of the ship. And so they all arrived safely at the island called Melita, which we now know as Malta. And the local people there, they are referred to as barbarous people. And they could see that these people that had come off the ship, of course, they were really wet. As they were coming ashore, they were wet from the sea and from the rain. And so they set about helping them all. Now, the expression barbarous people may have a derogatory feel to it, but it simply means people that had been unaffected by Greek culture. And the use of the double negative there, that they showed us no little kindness, it emphasises that they were in fact extremely kind to Paul and all the others. They went out of their way to be helpful to these strangers. The fact that it was still raining indicates that the storm was still well underway. As to the time of year, it would have been around November, so not the warmest time of year. But given its location, had it not been stormy, it would probably have been quite mild. But it was stormy. The winds of the storm and the wet had made this bedraggled party very cold indeed. And so a fire was built. And Paul, despite his rather messy and dishevelled condition, he gets stuck in as well. He too gathers wood for the fire. He didn't think that such work was below him. And that, of course, is how we must all be. True humility has its outworking. And this is all the more true in times of extremity. That's not my job really has no place in the Christian life. Now, of course, I do accept and believe that there are some positions where you would be more likely to think, well, that is their job. But the lesson here is that we must all, like Paul here, be willing to roll up our sleeves and get stuck in to help. And so Paul is doing this, and it happens then that a poisonous snake, presumably sleeping in the wood, awakes with the heat of the fire and bites Paul. The locals, they think that it's a sign that Paul must be a very wicked criminal, a murderer, no less, and that that justice has just caught up with him. Now, we probably think that's got superstition written all over it, and it most certainly is an error to think that all calamities are acts of judgment. However, it's not so much that it's an outright falsehood, it's rather more a twisting of the truth. But that kind of thinking has been widespread throughout history. I mean, you've only got to consider Job's supposed comforters to see this. It is something that's so deeply fixed in our human frame, that justice must be done. It is part of what leaves us without excuse when it comes to the knowledge of God. The problem is that because we are separated from God on account of our sin, we don't get the picture quite right. And so it has been common to think like these barbarians thought. We have lost sight of the truth that God's justice is mingled with mercy. So not everyone faces judgment in this world. Many are given plenty of opportunities to repent and turn back to God. And then, of course, some calamities, they're chastisements, really, rather than judgments. So these barbarians, they had what we could call a superstitious view of what happened to Paul. Anyway, no harm came to Paul. So the locals, nothing like going from one extreme to the other, the locals decided that he must be a god instead. When Elaine and I visited Malta on holiday at one time, a guide on a tour that we took recounted this event, and then she appeared to take great joy in saying, "But there aren't any poisonous snakes in Malta," as if to say, the Bible got that wrong, didn't it? But if you ever go to Malta, what you'll notice is you can't go anywhere without seeing buildings. It is very densely populated. So to say that there are no poisonous snakes on an island in the 21st century is not the same as saying there were no such snakes in the 1st century AD. When a human population grows in a restricted area, nasty creatures, they're pushed out. And then when they've got nowhere to go, they die out. That would seem to be what happened in Malta. Well, we hear no more about the natives in Malta, but next we are introduced to the chief man of the island, a certain Publius. And with a name like that, it would seem quite reasonable to conclude that he was the Roman governor of some description. He had quite an estate and used that to house the party for 3 days. Now, whether that was all 276 of them, or whether it was just the Roman soldiers, Paul and the prisoners, I can't tell, but he was plainly keen to help. And while they were there, then his father, the father of Publius, became sick. The consensus of opinion is that he was suffering from dysentery. And that is certainly what the Greek suggests. Now, dysentery is a nasty illness. It's not the kind of thing you can leave and, just expect it to go away. That doesn't happen. I had a bout of it when I was in India all those years ago, and I can tell you it's certainly no fun. And although it is easily treatable, had I not bitten the bullet and gone to see a doctor out there in India, I may well not be here today. Anyway, on this occasion, Paul laid his hands on this man, the father of Publius, and he was healed. But Paul also prayed so that it would be known that he was only the minister or the instrument of this miracle. He wasn't the author of it. He didn't just demand that this should happen. But as a result, of course, plenty of others, they came to be healed and were indeed healed. Now, nowhere in this account does it say that Paul preached the gospel to anybody, but it rather beggars belief to assume that he did not preach, given everything else that we know about him. And we can say that with all confidence because we know that the purpose of miracles was to validate apostolic authority and doctrine. They weren't just party pieces for them to perform. Now we discover they were in Malta for 3 months. So apart from the 3 days they spent on this estate of Publius, they must have found other lodgings more appropriate for them. Now, it is probably sometime in February when they left, so still not the best time to be sailing. However, as we saw with the last ship that Paul sailed on, it was up to the captain as to whether it was worth taking the risk or not. And so they sailed to Syracuse. Now, that's a place in Sicily, approximately 90 miles away. And there they paused their journey for 3 days and then headed to Rhegium, which is in the toe of Italy. You know, Italy is a boot shape. Well, Rhegium is in the toe bit, if you like. And from there they sailed to Puteoli. Now that appears to be halfway between Rhegium and Rome. It looks like Puteoli was the end of their sailing and that they went the rest of the way on foot. But at Puteoli they discover a group of believers, and these believers want Paul and Luke and Aristarchus to spend a week with them, and it appears that they did indeed spend that week there. Now, of course, that would have meant that all the other prisoners, we don't know how many other prisoners there were, but all of them, and all the Roman soldiers, that would have meant them staying there as well. So that was an amazing act of God's providence. We can see how well favoured Paul was in the eyes of Julius, the centurion. Now, some have suggested that this Julius may even have been converted under Paul's ministry. And that, of course, is quite possible. It's likely, even, given the way he behaved toward Paul. But we're not told that. We can't be sure of that. However, Julius has seen enough on this journey so far to know that Paul was a man of God and that he could be trusted not to make a run for it. So all of them get some rest for a week. Now, who had been instrumental in bringing the gospel to these Christians is also unknown. But it shouldn't surprise us that the gospel had travelled that far, given the ease of access there was throughout the Roman Empire. And we know that there was a good body of Christians in Rome before Paul got there. You know, when he wrote his letter to the Romans, he said that he had purposed many times to get to see them, but had thus far been unable to do so. So somebody had taken the gospel to the heart of the Roman Empire, and Paul was only now, as a prisoner, on his way to see them. And so after that week in Puteoli, they set off for Rome, so that's another about 140 miles away. And news that Paul was on his way evidently reached Rome, and a group of believers from there came down to meet them. And they met them at Appii, which would have been about 40 or 50 miles away from Rome. Now, that might not sound that far to you and me, but in pre-industrial times, it was a decent trek. They'd never met him before, and yet they really wanted to see him. They clearly cared about him, and it says Paul was encouraged by them, to know that the Lord had his faithful people there, to know that they were not ashamed of Paul the prisoner, and more importantly, that they were not ashamed of the gospel. That gave him more strength for what was to come. For Paul was a prisoner, and when they reached Rome, he had no idea what to expect. Now, what he got was a fair bit of latitude. He was placed under what we would call house arrest. So that's Paul's journey to Rome. But the big thing that stood out to me from this first half of chapter 28 was the two groups of people that we encounter at each end of that account. At the beginning, we have a group of superstitious pagans from Malta, and at the end, we have a group of Christians from Rome. And their behaviour was very similar. They both showed acts of kindness toward Paul and the others with him. The pagans showed their kindness by ensuring that these cold, wet people had the warmth of a fire. The Christians from Rome showed their kindness by going out of their way to meet Paul and encourage him in his labours. Both groups showed their love through their actions. Now, of course, if anyone was to object and to say that being kind to someone is not the same as loving them, I ask, isn't it? In 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 4, we are told that love is kind. And those of us who have the King James Version of the Bible, we know that the love being described in 1 Corinthians 13 is that greatest form of love, agape, translated charity in our Bibles, saying kindness is an act of love. So again, someone might say, yes, but the love of those pagans was very faulty. It wouldn't have been pure love. Well, we can't disagree with that statement. It would have been very faulty. But can any of us Christians say that our love is not faulty? I doubt it very much. There are many things that the Bible is very clear about, and those things we gather together and we give them a name. And one of those is total depravity. Now, this is the teaching that sin has utterly ruined the human race. Sin has left its mark on every aspect, every faculty of our humanity. It's not total in the sense that we are as bad can be. It is total in the sense that it is thorough. It reaches to every area, every sphere of our lives. So nobody who is not God can lay claim to perfect love. And yet everybody acknowledges the importance of love. Before I became a Christian, I strongly adhered to an ideology that believed we could change the world through love, despite growing evidence to the contrary. When I heard about Jesus, when I heard the gospel, I began to understand why human love failed with such great regularity. When I saw the love of God demonstrated in the life and death of Jesus, I began to appreciate the reality of what pure love actually looks like. So the gap between how we should love and how we do love is big. It is so big that we are never going to bridge that gap ourselves. To know and experience true love, we must come to Christ. Sin is the problem, and only Jesus has done anything about our sin. Turn to him in faith, and you can know the forgiveness of your sin. But we must understand that this requires us to submit to him as Lord. And as your Lord, he will subdue all of your enemies, of which sin is your chief enemy. But returning to our two groups of people, can we truly say those pagans acted out of love for Paul and the others? Well, I believe that I've shown that they did that. They did it through their kindness. And it shouldn't be a surprise to us when love is manifested in all sorts of people. It may not be perfect, but it is there. You see, another thing that the Bible is quite clear on is that God is love. The Bible uses that very expression twice, both in 1 John. And human beings are God's image bearers. And that is still the case, even though we have now a sinful condition. The death penalty was instigated after mankind's fall. In Genesis 9:6 it says, "Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And then it gives the reason for in the image of God made he man. So that's after the fall, well after the fall we could say. So we are still God's image bearers, even though that image has been severely marred by sin. Now, given that, it should be hardly surprising then that acts of love pop up all over the place. And of course, I appreciate when saying that, I appreciate what Paul wrote to Titus, describing our pre-converted state as being hateful and hating one another. See that in Titus 3 and verse 3. But that's a general statement, among others, as to what humanity is like. It also highlights, of course, how confused the natural state of humanity is. Anyway, we turn to the group of Christians at the end of the account we read, and they also show their love. And of course, we would expect that from them. That comes to us more obviously. Christians, having had their sins forgiven, appreciate that the two greatest commandments are to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind, and with all thy strength, and also to love thy neighbour as thyself. As Paul had also written to the Romans, love is the fulfilling of the law. It's Romans 13 and verse 10. So, although no Christian this side of the grave, no Christian say that they love perfectly, they should be getting better and better at it. But my point is, and this is why the two groups stood out to me, love on its own does not make someone a Christian. Both these groups displayed acts of love, but only one group was Christian. I heard it said once that Christianity is not all about doctrine, it is all about love. Now that statement in itself is actually a nonsense. Because to say that Christianity is all about love is a doctrine. So you've demolished that argument in itself. Now, while we acknowledge, and we should acknowledge, that love is the driving force in the Christian religion, we have to say that Christianity is a body of doctrine. After all, the word doctrine only means teaching. And what was the difference between the pagans in this passage and the Christians? It wasn't their behaviour. They were both very kind to these people. They both behaved in a loving manner. The difference was in what they believed. The pagans, being superstitious, evidently believed in false gods, even to the extent they thought, well, Paul might be a god. The Christians patently believed in the one true God. They had a different body of doctrine to these Maltese pagans. Now, of course, those of us who are believers, we know that Christianity is more than a body of doctrine. It's more than that, but it certainly is not less than that. So let me be clear. Here. I am in no way seeking to belittle the importance and place of love individually and corporately as a church that love has. As I say, love is our driving force. But let us remember, one of the things said of the devil is that he is subtle. We read that in Genesis chapter 3. When people say things like Christianity is all about love, not doctrine, there is a subtlety at work there. It's a good soundbite, but what's it doing? Well, we certainly agree that love is at the heart of Christianity. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. I don't think any of us would gainsay that. But love does not equal Christianity. we have seen that all people are capable of loving because they are all God's image bearers. But we also know that not all humans are Christians. So when we start bandying about statements to the effect that doctrine is unimportant, we are loosing people's grip on the Bible. Now, that might be intentional or it might be unintentional, but it is what happens. It doesn't matter what you believe, you've just got to love. But that has the great potential of closing heaven's doors to you by suggesting that they are wide open to you. Everybody can love, so heaven must be open for everybody. And yet the truth is vastly different to that. Even that verse we just quoted, John 3:16, even that tells us so. It is only those who believe in God's only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, that shall have everlasting life instead of perishing. Anyone that tries to draw your attention away from Jesus really doesn't care that much for you. So what is it then that we believe? Well, we have to believe that Jesus is who he said he was, the Son of God. And by extension, of course, we have to believe that God is a Trinity. We have to believe that Jesus came into the world to save sinners, which he did by bearing their sins and dying for them on that cross. We have to believe that he was resurrected on the third day and subsequently that he ascended to heaven where he now is. Now there's more, but that is the essence of what we believe. And we have to believe that our belief, our faith in him, will gain us all that is promised. That is, the forgiveness of our sin, a renewing by the Holy Spirit, and an assurance of our place in heaven. These are some of the doctrines that make up Christianity. These are the doctrines that bring us to salvation. So while it is true that anyone who knows all the right doctrine but lacks love, while it's true that it's highly likely that they're a fraud, we must be equally wary of anyone suggesting that doctrine is not important. It is a very subtle lie. But if our doctrine is sound, if it really is drawn from the Bible, it will lead us to greater and greater love. It's inevitable that that will happen. Hence Jesus could say, "By this shall all men know that ye are my disciples, if ye have love one to another." So may that be true of us. May that be true of us today and always. Amen.